thank you for joining us. If you're joining us, you're probably interested in learning more about collaboration and talking really, I'm joined with John. We'll give our introductions here shortly, but we were really talking about how a lot of times people only talk about quality when it comes to the QA folks or the QA team's responsibility, but really collaboration can really help with quality, and quality should start well before even testing comes to mind. So we wanted to walk through a couple of different techniques, a couple of different different development styles that can help you with collaboration. Also hear some of your pain points to make sure that we're guiding this webinar correctly, but that's what really inspired us for writing this webinar today. So to get started, I am the person on the right. My name is Bria Grangard. I am here on the product team at SmartBear, working on a few of our different products in our test management space, as well as our UI functional automated testing tools. I'm super happy to be here and joined with John.
Hi, everybody.
All right, so John is one of the engineers. He's going to be supporting us in
I was supposed to give more of an introduction myself.
Yeah, he didn't do very well on that one, but
certainly.
He will be joining us and helping us with demos, as well as here to answer any technical questions you might have. So feel free to challenge him. We love to see if we can stump him. That's one of my favorite activities. So what's on the agenda for today? Want to give you a quick introduction as to who is bringing you this webinar. Also a few housekeeping items. Yes, this webinar is being recorded. The slides are also going to be made available to you all after this, so you can feel free to share as you see fit. We'll then be walking through a few different key takeaways, the need for universal language, using a design-driven approach, as well as the importance of peer code review. We'll have a live demonstration, and this I'm really looking forward to walking us through all of these techniques we talk about and how to actually go about implementing them. And we will have a question and answer time at the end. Hopefully we do a good job pacing ourselves. But throughout this entire webinar, please feel free to use the Q&A box. John and I are going to both be monitoring it, and it's wonderful to hear from you all and just make sure that we're addressing what you want to hear today. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started real quickly. I just want to let you know who SmartBear is and who's bringing you this webinar. So we were founded in 2009, and we have 11 global offices. A lot of folks know us for our flagship products, Soap UI, as well as Swagger, but we have over 15 different products in our products portfolio with over 6.5 million users and 22,000 customers. And we also do have 5 free tools, so feel free to check out one or more of our tools. And really, we have a wide range of products in our portfolio that you'll see all the way from the design and planning phase through the creation of tests, through the actual execution of tests on both the UI side, the API side, as well as running across the device lab, and finally there in the monitoring and operations. And so we just want to make sure we are hearing from you all. So going to go ahead and launch a poll real quickly. And so how would you rate your pain when it comes to collaboration on your development team? Whether it's between developers and testers, product and development, whether that's between you and your best friend on the team, but like, how would you rate it? What are your feelings? Do you think it's not a problem at all? Maybe a little bit of a problem, something we can improve on, or is it like, this is truly something that is stopping our success and we could be so much more successful if we improved our collaboration? So about 50% of the votes are in. I'll go ahead and give, 72%. All right, that jumped real quickly. Thank you, folks. And 80. All right. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and share with you kind of the results. So it looks like, the majority of you really fell into, we have communication mishaps here and there. About 50% of you are there. And then split between it's, this has to stop now. This is completely frustrating and really hurting us versus we have no problems in collaboration. So for those of you who are in that bucket, please feel free to share with us what you are doing. And if you're practicing any of the techniques we are going to discuss today. So with that, we want to go ahead and get started. When we think about software and what used to really happen in software development, it was really broken down into multiple different phases, and you've all heard of this, right? It was a siloed process, waterfall development style, and people had different responsibilities across each of the phases of the SDLC. You might be business, you might be in charge of planning. You had your developers who were in charge of designing, development, and documentation. You had your QA folks who were responsible for testing. And then you had your operations engineers who might be responsible for your deployment as well as your monitoring. What we want to talk about is how, quality was really left up here to phase 3, and those groups right here in that third bucket in the testing phase. And you really don't need to wait to verify quality at that phase when you can start designing and developing with quality at the forefront all the way in the very beginning when you're planning and designing and developing, as mentioned in buckets 1 and 2. So it's really important to start thinking about the breakdown in silos, things like the 3 amigos meetings, getting multiple different people involved and in the room from the start, and recognizing that the traditional roles, the traditional style of development creates serious barriers when it comes to collaboration. And in order to improve collaboration as a whole, it can be really helpful to break down these barriers and no longer say, I'm just the developer who's responsible for designing, developing, and documenting, but maybe I should be playing a role as well in some of the testing and the planning and the design. So we wanted to walk you through a kind of our story of what we will be sharing throughout this as an example. So once upon a time, love a good story time, we had a group of developers who were working on designing, developing, and testing an API. On the team, there's a whole slew of different folks. We have product team members, developers, testers, and operations engineers. Some team members are working in the same office, but there are other team members who are remote. So what are they developing? They're developing an API for a pet store, and it needs to be able to do some basic functionality. They need to be able to add a pet to the store, find a pet by a certain status, whether that's through searching or filtering, update a pet with some data, some basic pet functions. And they're going to be hosting this as a web application. And they need to get the app up as soon as possible, which I think every software team feels that they need to get everything done as soon as possible. So where did this start? It all started with an idea. And so this is where we're going to break it up into our 3 different phases that we'll be walking through for collaboration. So for those of you who may or may not have seen this graphic, this one always cracks me up. I absolutely love it. But just looking at the different folks who are involved in this image and how the first image is severely different from the last image and also everything in between. And really in this image, we're highlighting the differences and the problems that can come about when you lack collaboration, all the way from the very beginning of trying to identify the customer need. In this picture, we see that the customer need was this 3 plank swing, and that's how they explained it. However, then the project leader kind of got their input, and that's they translated it into a 1 plank swing, and that's how they understood it. Then looking at how the engineer designed it, actually slicing the tree in half and making them swing through the middle. How the programmer wrote it, sounds like they made it a little bit more complicated, and it's also the swing is no longer a swing.
They're good at doing that.
My favorite is always this one on how the sales executive described it, this luxurious chair. And then how the project was documented. We all love documentation for sure. That's such a fun part of the process. How operations installed it, only part of it's there. Maybe we're missing a few critical pieces. Then, how the customer was billed, how the help desk supported it, and what the customer really needed at the end of the day. So all the way from what the customer really needed versus how the customer explained it versus all the different folks who were involved, look at how much the difference was in collaboration and what was described at every phase here. And this is really just, of course, an exaggerated example of issues that are faced when it comes to collaboration, but it is realistic of what I hear and what John hears can be interpreted in 2 different ways. So how do we make sure that when we're both moving forward, we're moving forward with the same plan or idea in mind?
And this is what really kind of drove the adoption of more agile practices. For some teams who maybe are still in the waterfall side of the world, these types of problems is what made people say, hey, can we do this differently? Can we have shorter iterations where we think about what will the completed product be and who are the stakeholders that need to be involved to make sure that that product is completed as expected? And that's where all this collaboration is going to come in as we go through that.
Yeah, and so also I think a major style of development that's been adopted when identifying that collaboration has been an issue is behavior-driven development. And so for those who are not very familiar with behavior-driven development, it is a software development process where teams create simple steps on how an application should behave from a user's perspective. So I'm curious to hear from you, how many of you are doing behavior-driven development today? So if I was good at this polling thing, I'd launch it correctly, but clearly I'm not doing a great job at that. So there we go, poll number 2. So the reason for this, John just mentioned the adoption of agile practices, and this is behavior-driven development is one development style that really aligns with the agile practice or agile methodology. And so that's why we're seeing so many people who are interested in learning about behavior-driven development or are wanting to learn how they can communicate a little bit better with their teams. And that is what drives them to BDD as a potential solution. About 60%, oh, it just jumped, 75%. Y'all are very fast at responding. Much appreciated from our end. Okay, I'll go ahead and share the results. All right, so it looks like about 50% of this group are not using BDD, which is great. We'll give you an introduction on it. So if you are interested, we can hopefully guide you through that and explain a little bit more. And then we have some folks who are definitely using it, a few folks out there who are experts, and some folks who are just getting started or have implemented it in their practices. Cool, good to know. So for those of you who aren't as familiar with BDD, that's okay. For those of you who are, this is going to be a really quick review. So what is BDD? Really, it's based on these 3 different practices of discovery, formulation, and automation. It's a form of software development in which an application is specified and designed based on how its behavior is perceived to someone on the outside. And really, you want to create a shared understanding rooted and based in examples. And we'll actually walk you through how people can create examples, what are good ways to create examples, so on and so forth. And it really uses these examples to drive all of the development activities. And you'll see from there the development, the testing, as well as the documentation. And a really cool component of BDD as well is this idea of creating and sharing living documentation. So it brings together a few different important folks, the business, the testers, as well as the developers. And you want to make sure you're really sitting in that common overlap. And that's why a lot of people adopt these 3 amigos meetings, where you make sure that all 3 of these folks are in the room and discussing from the very beginning how they want their application to behave. And so there is like a common language and a way to work within behavior-driven development and when creating a BDD scenario. So as we just spoke, there's the business, there's development, and then there's testers. When you look at the business folks, they really want to define requirements in spoken word scenarios. They want to be able to say, hey, this is what it should be doing, not necessarily, they want to remove all the ambiguity. They also want to obtain the feedback in a clear way, and as we mentioned, really rooted in examples. When it comes to development, they want to make scenarios that either pass or work and guides the development efforts. They should also be extremely focused in on those examples that were defined previously. They want to easily translate these scenarios into tests, or at least make it easier on the testers to be able to do that. And they'll usually be defining using the Gherkin syntax or a given, when, and then structure. Then we come to the testers. So they'll be creating scenarios that have actions as well as expected results. And by doing this, it really allows for easy reporting and traceability as well as documentation. So how do you go about actually creating and writing some of these BDD scenarios? You want to begin by focusing on the value first. The question why should be repeated over and over and over again, and that should be the first step. Why are we developing this feature, and why will this feature help my user? And a feature should have a description that also has some context to give you some background. And we can do this in a few different ways. This is the way we recommend, but doing in order to get a benefit as a, insert the role, I want X feature. And so to give you an example real quickly. One of the products we work on here is called Hip Test. It's a BDD collaboration platform. And when we were looking at Hip Test, we were looking at including a Slack integration. And we're like, yeah, obviously we're going to include a Slack integration. Slack's super popular. We want to provide to our customers. But we didn't necessarily think about, or we actually needed to think about, beyond just including a Slack integration, why should we do this? Who should be getting the notification? Should everyone be getting a notification? Should only Hip Test users be able to get notified? And so what we landed on is it was outside of just Hip Test users who needed these different notifications. And it was actually everyone on the team who needed these notifications, whether or not they were working daily inside of the product. But having this discussion before starting development saved a lot of time. So we weren't launching an integration and then being like, oh crap, we're actually really missing the user's need. So giving that context and asking why and really figuring out the customer value is important from the very start. So now how to actually go about writing scenarios, you need to be declarative. So in the first step, we focused on the why. Now we're going to go ahead and focus on the what. So there's two different styles of writing your test scenarios. The first is the imperative. This can be, long scenarios with low-level steps describing how to navigate through the user interface. You can think of very detailed, it's like this person is going to click on it with using this mouse with the right click of the button, very, very detailed steps. And it can be appropriate, but it can also leave us with gaps in our testing. We found that with the declarative style of writing and using the Gherkin syntax, that folks have had more success when they're really focusing on the what and not necessarily the how someone is going to do it. So when thinking of the Gherkin syntax, there's those three steps that we talked about: the given, the when, as well as the then. So given is kind of your setup, your background. Given that this is going on, or given my user is going to navigate to this page, or given this is the web page that's set up. When is the action that's going to be taken? So when my user clicks on this button. Then is your assertion. What should then happen based on the action that was just described above? So these can also have ands, they can have buts, they can have really, that's it, but that's okay. So these can be supplemented with more details where you see fit. But this is that framework that you should be using, and this is what folks are referring to as the Gherkin syntax.
And it's important to note that those are linked back to, on the previous slide when we saw in order to get a benefit as a role, I want a feature, that flows through those different scenarios such that we're looking at the user perspective, the role's perspective. So maybe when someone goes through a scenario as one role, they have different expectations than a different role, and you need to capture that and include that when you're writing these scenarios.
And so we also wanted to give, a little bit of an example. And so given I am logged in, when I add an item to the cart and I click on the cart, then I should see the item I added. So you might be asking, why is this declarative? It doesn't matter how someone did the login. They might have used their username. They might have used their password. They could have done the facial recognition. They could have done Touch ID. There's so many different ways that the user could have logged in, but all we're talking about is, hey, the user logged in. So we also wanted to give an example for our pet store that we're going to continue to talk about today. And this is really imperative versus declarative example for the pet store. On the left-hand side in gray, we have the imperative style. So given I have a pet in my cart, when I provide my credit card information, then I should be able to click the checkout button. I'll let you do the declarative one.
All right. So on the declarative side, we have given I have a pet in my cart, when I provide a valid payment information, then it should be able to check out. And as we just talked about, the difference here is the declarative scenario does not tell us how we should be checking out. And that's important because if we go with just the imperative scenario, we may leave gaps in our development or testing. For example, what happens if you have a gift card? What happens if you have a PayPal account, right? And if we don't account for those things, then we could have holes in our product or in our testing. The declarative example forces us to have a conversation between the developers and the business people, whoever else is working on this particular bit of functionality, this payment information, this checkout functionality, forces us to have a conversation about what does valid payment information mean? What does checkout mean? And then if we go back to having a common language, we've defined what valid payment means for our product. So now every time someone on our product team, whether it's the PO or developer, says, hey, that's a valid payment option, we know valid payment option is a special word that means something, and we know what that means because we've had that conversation.
So we're going to wrap up this section, and then we have a few questions we're going to go ahead and answer before we move on to our next one, our next section here. But the last section is really focused on, we talked about BDD is driven in discovery, formulation, as well as automation. And we recognize that in order to move faster, teams are constantly feeling this pressure, and a really successful way that they can do this is through test automation. So if you've set up your BDD scenarios to work in that style, as we mentioned, the given, when, then, Gherkin syntax, you can also make sure you're focusing on building a test automation framework that will then scale with those efforts as well. We recognize that, usually your first execution, it's going to fail. That's because the feature has not been implemented. Then you should implement your feature, run the automated BDD scenario to show the feature is complete, and repeat it. And there's ways to do this that are a lot easier. And we're going to walk through how to do that, whether you're technical, or talk about strategies for technical, non-technical users, as well as, you might have a favorite automation framework you might want to be using. And we recognize that. When you adopt BDD, it does not mean leave everything that you're doing behind, but rather figure out how you can fit it into your solution or your style of development in your team, and also work with what you currently have. Maybe you love Selenium, maybe you love, I don't know, Task Complete, because that's the tool that we use here and I'm familiar with. But that's okay, but you don't need to, leave everything behind in order to start automating. And then when you do start with automation, that is an important part of behavior-driven development as a whole.
Do you mind if I address these two questions?
Yeah, let's go for it.
Cool. So Donna, to your first question, to sum up for everybody else, the question is, if you have a declarative scenario like the one we just saw on the previous slide, it is pretty general, right? It's a broad statement. How do I automate that, and how do I make that repeatable? So it fits in very well to the slide we're looking at here. The idea is eventually I would break those down into more specific scenarios. So for example, if I were to write this in a BDD style, I may have a grid that I would put through my BDD scenario. So I may say, every time I go through this, use one of these values from this grid. So I would data drive this BDD scenario to kind of get a little bit more on the implementation side of things. Later, we're going to show a couple tools that we have that help us facilitate some of these different types of collaboration. So specifically for BDD, we'll look at hip tests and how you can data drive a hip test. But ultimately, we would want to break these down to things that are more specific, either by putting variables into these scenarios. So for example, maybe valid payment becomes a variable, and then we pass through credit card, we pass through gift card, PayPal, whatever different payment options there may be. So we would eventually break them down to things that we could automate and run repeatedly as part of a automated build pipeline. And Shaylee, to your question, and I click on the cart, should we use the word click? It depends on your product, but in the case of this particular example, we would try to avoid the word click, because what happens if I'm using a phone to access the store? In that case, I may tap. And click and tap could have very different meanings within our organization and our team. So we want to find those words that have a special meaning, and that's where that common language comes in. If click is a specific action for your product, specifically tied to your web interface, then you want to reserve that word for only performing clicks, and at the highest level, you want to generalize that scenario. And then maybe also have a word for tap and whatever other ways you could interface with your store.
Yeah, and I think those are really great questions and super helpful. Thanks, Jonathan, for the answers. So feel free, folks, as you keep having them, to write them in. Really want to make sure we're giving you as much information that we can be. And the final thing in wrapping up this BDD section is that after automation, we recognize that there's this whole concept of documentation, and people don't always love and look forward to doing documentation. So if you can find a tool, if you can find a way of documenting that allows you to constantly update your documentation without doing extra turns of work and putting in a lot more time, then that can really be helpful for you. It can also be helpful for if you're a manager or reporting out for your managers, and you're no longer spending, 20% of your time just going back and making sure that all of your documentation is up to date. And that's really the idea of living documentation behind BDD. So takeaway number one from this webinar is really having that one universal language can remove ambiguity between various stakeholders, as John just described. The difference between click, the difference between tap, the difference between, oh, I know on my phone it's like Face ID. That's my signing that worked, and that's how I want to log in. And that's why I'm really making sure that we are careful with our words. It's like going back to elementary school, John, when my mom always told me to be careful with my words. All right. So we're going to go ahead and move into phase two. I'll hand this over to you.
Cool. And I'm actually just going to take one of these questions that popped up really quick before we get away from BDD. And the question is, can TDD be described as it is similar to Scrum framework? The thing about Scrum is kind of like a specific philosophy or specific process that you would follow to help facilitate these types of things. And TDD is similar in that approach, where it's really a philosophy, or philosophy is the wrong word, but it's something that you would follow to help you realize an end goal, where the end goal is quality software that is fully tested, right? So you want to minimize the amount of bugs that you're going to find. So in that case, that they are similar in the sense that they're just a tool that can help you realize an end goal. But there may be other ways to realize the end goal. For example, with Scrum, you don't necessarily have to do everything in Scrum to get the end goal, which is a more collaborative, iterative product development environment. But it sure helps if you do all the things in Scrum. But it's not to say that you have to do all the things in Scrum. And again, just like TDD, it's more of a thing that you want to be thinking about. You want to use it to help you get to your end goal. So hopefully that answered the question. Maybe that was a little bit of a vague answer, but let me know if it didn't. We can.
Yeah, and I think another question that we get pretty often, John, is the relationship of TDD and BDD,
yep.
And how they fit together. And just real quickly, we don't want to dive too much into it in case you're not curious, and I'm just speaking to speak, but TDD and BDD are not mutually exclusive. There is a synergy between them. They should fit together. And if you do want to learn more, feel free to ask us and we can send you on some resources about that.
Yep.
All right, so phase two.
This one's me?
Yeah.
Okay, phase two. So a design-driven approach. So what are we talking about here? So phase one was, we're going to go through 3 sections here. So the first section was all about like why we want to do something and then collaborating on the why. The second section here is more about what we're going to do, what this thing that we're going to build is going to look like, and how to collaborate on that. And specifically, we're going to relate this to software development in the way that we talk about building different services that need to interact with each other. So when we're talking about design-first approach, we're looking at when we have a service, one team will be consuming the service, one team will be producing the service. How can we collaborate on that? And in this case, the first thing we want to do is have a plan. So what is the goal of this service? Who will be the consumer of this service? And what data, what information does this service need to provide to the consumers so that they can effectively use it? And the reason we want to do this is, as the bullet point here says, optimize for parallel development. So a great example is, let's say you have 2 teams working on a larger product that's broken up into services. Team A is going to be the consumer and team B is going to be the producer. In a traditional environment, team B would start building their service and team A would have to wait, do something else in order to start developing their end of the service, the thing that will consume team B's finished product. Obviously, that extends the release cycle. It makes working in a scaled environment a lot harder. So what we want to do is figure out a way for them to work in parallel. If team A could look at team B and say, okay, I know what data you're going to be giving me. I can start working on my end. You can start working on your end. And then eventually we can just see if the 2 connect, and they should, because I know what I expect. I know the expected values, the data that should be coming from that service. So it really helps with parallel development and reducing release cycles and reducing roadblocks that come from that kind of sequential approach. And it's important to get feedback early. Like I said, we've been talking about consumers and producers. You want to have both of those parties talking to each other, collaborating, so that you understand exactly what is the data transfer. You don't want the team producing the service to guess at what the team consuming the service needs. In that case, they may build the wrong thing, and then now you have to double back and fix stuff, and there's a huge cost. We call it the phrase technical debt here. There's a huge cost to changing things that you've already implemented. You have to go back, you have to redesign it, you have to put your development team has to put themselves back into the headspace that they were in when they were originally building it. So we want to minimize that by having that collaboration early and getting feedback continuously throughout the process. And this is very similar to a lot of the concepts that we see in Scrum. Okay, so I think I've talked a lot about this already. But what we want to do, and I think the thing, let me check my own notes I have on this slide. I think the thing that I want to call out here on this slide is, again, there's a right level of upfront design that makes sense. And I know that if I say you want to design first and collaborate on the design first, that sounds kind of counterintuitive to the general trend to move towards a more agile, iterative approach. What we don't want to do is say, this is how all of our interactions will work. So if we're using the example of an API, which we'll see later, I don't want to say these are all my API endpoints that I could ever possibly have in my product. And this is how every single API endpoint is going to produce data or consume data. What I want to do is just say, here's one API endpoint. And we're going to work on this particular API endpoint for this particular sprint. And hey, consumer team, come over here and talk to me because I'm the producing team. And let's make sure we're on the same page about what this particular endpoint, what data it should provide or what data it should take in the request or in the response. And then we'll go and build that thing. And if after that sprint, we need to do more work on that, we can iterate again. And if not, we can move on to the next endpoint. So that's when we say we want to design first, it's the right amount of design first. Not too much design, but a little bit of design to help both teams work more effectively and in the future, reduce the amount of the rework that we have to do. All right, so we have a few best practices here. And the first one is get feedback as early as possible. And again, this goes back to pulling in the right people who need to be involved with the design of the thing that you're going to build. So whether that's an architect, consumers and producers, maybe it's your dev team and another dev team, external stakeholders, pulling in the people will get the feedback as early as possible so that when you go to build the thing, you have confidence that you can build it and you know what your bumpers are, right? You know like what the guardrails are for how much wiggle room you have with designing and doing your work. The second thing is mock services. And mock services are really helpful, especially with parallel development. So if we go back to that example where you have one team who will be acting as consumers and another team acting as producers, the team who will be acting as consumers, if they're developing their features and their stuff the same time that the producers are, they may want to test and start to play around with the functionality which the producers are building, but obviously that doesn't exist yet. So you can use mock services to give you a way to play around with some dummy data while the other team is building the real thing. And then when you're done, you should be able to just swap in the real thing and it should work. So mock services can be really helpful in that kind of pursuit. And same thing with a few other points here, alert users to upcoming changes. We want to make sure that when we've made changes to something, when we've made changes to the agreement of how things are going to interact with each other, we tell everybody what those changes will be. We want to minimize the number of surprises, right? I shouldn't be surprised if my service changes. If we go back to the first point, if I'm collaborating from the start, there should be no surprises. I should know that my service is going to change. And then when it does change, I should be alerted that the changes were finalized. And for the last one, take advantage of a platform solution, especially as teams grow. Let's say Bria and I were just working on an API. It's really easy for us to just talk about, hey, I'm going to be able to give you this data. Cool, that makes sense. But if Bria and I scaled our company to have 200 people, now it's a lot harder for us to have that conversation. So using a platform that can bring in all these different pieces, like the mock service, like the ability to collaborate, can be really helpful. And obviously we're going to look at this a little bit later when we look at our offering that helps us do that with Swagger Hub. All right, and this is just an example from Swagger Hub. And again, we'll look at this live later, but what we're looking at over here is something that will help us interact with the the documentation as we're building it. So let's say, again, going back, Bree and I are working on, we're going to build an API. As we're defining what that API is going to look like, what does a request to my endpoint look like? In this case, the pet endpoint. What does the response look like when I put to this pet endpoint? We can play around with that using our living documentation within Swagger Hub. And we'll see this live in a little bit.
So really the second takeaway here that we want to get you to get out of this second section is really the right amount of upfront design. And as John's talked about, for collaboration and just thinking a little bit before actually developing and running to it, it will allow teams to mitigate dependencies and also work in parallel for faster delivery. So rather than doing that sequential process, and you've heard the benefits now of parallel design for faster delivery, if you do this design-driven approach, you can really be more mindful of that and think about the design first, and then it will obviously have benefits. So just given time, we're going to keep going ahead here with phase 3. Now it's actually time to code, but please keep answering your questions. If we don't answer them out loud, we will still type an answer to them and make sure we get to them. So thank you for the great ones so far that have come in. And just in essence of time, we're going to skip this poll question, but moving forward, we wanted to talk about really code collaboration and the importance of code review here. So using our given when then, we wanted to embrace that a little bit more. So we only did the when and then here, but when someone knows what is expected of them when reviewing code, then they are more likely to be satisfied with the overall software quality. And you can see that here in this chart, given, you know, the size of the bubbles, as well as just the sample size in general. So there on the x-axis, we have whether the reviewer understands expectations, and on the y, the satisfaction with the overall software quality. You can see that as you, we would like to see larger size bubbles here in the right top quadrant, which is what we are seeing. When you understand expectations, you're happier with the quality overall. So I think that makes sense. And when we're thinking about the different folks who are involved with coding, it's important to also recognize there are different roles when it comes to code review. So we have reviewers, we have authors, we also have observers and moderators. Is there anything you wanted to say more on this one, John?
Not a ton, but
right.
you know, these roles may have different meanings for your organization. So you know, we can be aware of that, and having the ability to define what those roles are is important.
Yeah. And so why do people believe like code review is beneficial? What do they get out of it? And these are just a few of the findings we've found. So with, you know, over 1,100 responses, people seem to respond with 90% of improved software quality. So you're improving it before you even start the testing phase. So right in the beginning of development, you're reviewing each other's work. I'm like, hey, John, you really missed this semicolon that's going to cause this entire thing to break. And maybe we save a lot of energy before we even pass it off then to our testing counterparts who might find it then. And, you know, every time you wait a little bit longer, every bug, every mishap, everything you find increases exponentially in cost. We're also finding a few other key benefits are just going back to that shared knowledge across the team. So we see that with the universal language, understanding what we want our application to do. So just having that shared knowledge, and as well as, you know, setting some standards around coding and ability to mentor. Like this would be the perfect opportunity, John, for you to mentor me in my development skills. So
yep, absolutely.
Maybe we'll just start only communicating in code from here on out.
That sounds like a very good plan.
Maybe for you. And so we also wanted to see a little bit of what are people currently reviewing and things that you can think about implementing into your organization here. As you know, folks are reviewing everything from requirements through documentation, user stories, so on and so forth. And the two different bars are the two different sample sizes we have from 2017 compared to 2018. So it looks like, you know, a ton of folks are still reviewing their requirements, test cases, as well as design docs.
Mind if I hop in here really quick? I know we're running a little bit short on time, but
I will allow it.
Cool. And as teams are moving to DevOps, they're able to release more frequently. And the thing that's important to remember is when you can release more frequently, it becomes much more important that when you do release, your product is really ready to be released. So the definition of ready for release is something that's important to look at. And the reason we're showing this slide here in these different artifacts is because for a lot of products, ready for release goes beyond just the code works. We also need to make sure that the code meets the requirements, as we've talked about with hip test. We also need to make sure that things like our documentation is updated. If that's not updated, people are going to be really upset when they try to figure out how a new feature works. We need to make sure that the UX meets our requirements, right? So there's all these different things that we need to verify when some code is changed beyond just the code. So it's important that we apply peer review to these things in conjunction with the code in preparation for faster release cycles.
That was nice. You did well.
Thank you. I tried.
And so, we all know Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and, we all need some trust. We need some food, some basic things to survive. And really that's what is also put together here with this graphic, and also broken down into, team, your active collaboration, as well as continuous improvement there on the right side. But when looking at, the baseline, a foundation, it's like a relationship. We all need to have some trust. And then from there, we need our expectations to be clear. And I think that's a common theme and thread you've heard throughout this, whether it's rooting it in examples, being clear from the very start with designing, and setting clear expectations. There's this thought of accountability, collective ownership. We all are working towards the same thing. It's not just John, it's your fault if this went wrong. It's, hey, Bria and John, you both have some ownership.
Then how can we keep blaming me if things kind of go wrong?
John, you're not supposed to admit that in public. And then, having clear communication channels, which also helps with fast feedback. And we just wanted to show this quickly, but once again, we're going to dive into the product here shortly, so we don't need to spend too much time there. But really, the big takeaway we want for you all to take away from this third section is that collaboration between the delivery team can help with ensuring quality, both short-term as well as long-term. And that's why, we're continuing to see so many things today in a collaborative culture. We're really all involved in this. I guarantee you're all using at least one, if not 2 or 4 or 8 or 10 of these. I think we're all using Zoom right now. So checking off that box, that works well. But from Git to Slack to Swagger to Confluence and Jira, it's all about collaboration. And that's going to lead us here to our key takeaways before we dive into the demo. So quality doesn't happen during just the QA phase of development. And it's really a pillar to success collaboration is a pillar to success when it comes to quality. And we walk through each of these bullet points, but having that one universal language can remove ambiguity between different stakeholders. And the right amount of upfront design will allow teams to mitigate dependencies and work in parallel for faster delivery, as we talked about, for a design-driven approach. And finally, collaboration between the delivery team can help with ensuring quality. So with that, I'm going to let you start sharing your screen, which is kind of going to terrify me, John. I'm giving you control.
I promise not to abuse my power.
So there you go. You should have it. And once again, he'll be going through a demo. We might be a little short on Q&A time, so please feel free to ask them in the box, and we'll make sure to get to them throughout this demo, and I'll try to type the answers as quickly as possible.
Yeah. So we'll work through the different sections that we just went through. We'll work through our products in the same section. And again, we're looking at collaboration around the why we're doing something with hip test, collaboration around, let me just pull this up, the what we need to do with Swagger Hub, and then the collaboration around the how we actually did it with code review with Collaborator. So we'll start with hip test, and hip test is a tool built to help make the process of writing BDD scenarios easier and more effective. And the way it does that is by giving you a place to build these different scenarios and manage that portfolio of scenarios for you. So we have our pet store that we're going to see throughout these different things here. So I've defined my different ways I want to maybe interact with my pet store: managing pets, managing the store, managing users. I have a way up here to make it very clear and easy what exactly the goal is for the pet. So in order to find the right pet for me as a prospective caretaker, I'm defining who my user is. I want information on the pets that are available from the store. I'm defining what my motivation is. Now we have some sub scenarios underneath this. And where hip test starts to get powerful is when I define these scenarios, not only does it just help me write these things kind of like an IDE and make it a little bit better, but I can reuse these particular scenario, what we call action words. So if I say given the pet is not in the store, if I start typing another line, let's say given the pet, you'll notice that HipTest is suggesting different action words I could use that I've already used. So that goes back to creating the common language for the team, the product team. HipTest helps us do that by keeping a library of these action words that we used in the past. So now I know the pet is not in the store. That's a specific thing that means something. When the pet is not in the store, that everybody knows what that means. Rather than having maybe a few different ways of saying that, now we have one way of saying that. And going back to that question about how could I have different specific scenarios if I'm writing my scenario in a more generalized way in that declarative format, how can I go through the different payment options? That's another thing we're seeing HipTest is going to help out with that, where I can say, hey, name is actually going to be a variable called name, and photo is going to be a variable called photo URL. And then up here in my data table, and I haven't defined these, but up here I could define these different data sets for name and photo URL. So maybe I create a new pet with the name of dog and a photo to a dog, right? So I can iterate through these different, more specific imperative type scenarios by defining the declarative scenario, using variables to say when things could change, and then defining the variables in a data table. And we'll see why this is important when you export these tests later. So this would be the first kind of level or place where you have collaboration within HipTest. Another important thing to note is the documentation. So this is the other powerful side of HipTest, is helping you not just collaborate around building scenarios, but showing you which scenarios actually exist. So in this case, I've defined a sprint 1, and I'm looking at all the scenarios that are included in sprint 1. So now I can very clearly see at the end of the sprint, when I deliver this working feature, this working sprint, all my tests pass. That means all my features, all my scenarios are implemented. And if all those scenarios are implemented, these are all the things that I'm able to do. So again, having that documentation so you can learn, so the different stakeholders can come to an agreement on what exactly was done, is really helpful. And then the final thing I'll talk about in HipTest, and again, it becomes really powerful when we connect the scenarios to actual tests. What I can do is I can export these scenarios into different frameworks over here, and then I can use those frameworks to build automated tests. And I'll actually hop to Collaborator quick to look at that, because I've done that in Collaborator. So I've pulled out some stuff. Actually, this was generated from Swagger, but I can generate the frameworks for my tests, and then I can start implementing my tests. But again, where it becomes really powerful is if I go back to my scenarios, if I'm using the same action word in multiple tests, when I define that, or when I implement a test for that action word once, if I build a new scenario that uses that same action word, and then I export that scenario and put it in part of my automation framework, that test is ready to run because all the bits of it that need to be implemented are already implemented. So it can help you build out your automation or your test coverage very easily.
We have a quick question.
Sure.
So the example has a maximum of 2 variables. What if there are 5 or 6 variables? Do you put all of them in the when test step?
You can put those anywhere. I just happen to put them in the when. So I could put some variables over here in the given. I could put variables anywhere, and I could put as many variables as I wanted to. I was just running out of brain power towards the end of the day when I was making this. So I went with 2 and I put it in one spot. But yeah, you could put variables anywhere.
Great.
It's very, very forgiving and free form. All right, so let's move to the next section. So again, the first section we talked about why are we doing this, collaboration around the why. Now we'll look at Swagger Hub, collaboration on the what are we going to do. So Swagger Hub, if we go back to that specific example of designing an API, is going to help us determine upfront what that what design looks like. And the big things when it comes to collaboration for Swagger Hub is what we're looking at over here, where I can define my API documentation, my API contract, and then over here, I can play around with what that API will look like. So I can define all my different endpoints, and within those endpoints, I can define what should a request look like, what should the various responses look like, what does the authentication look like. So the point is I can use Swagger Hub to design this API before I go into actually implementing the API. And again, we're not going to, in real life, we're probably not going to design all these different endpoints at once. Maybe we'll start with a subset and then slowly build it out as we understand what endpoints are needed. But the cool thing with Swagger Hub when it comes to collaboration also is if we have different teams who will be working on this API, they may all need to implement maybe the same way of handling a response or a request, things like that. So I can define these schemas down here, and I'll go to one of those in a second, to help me standardize what a request looks like. And we see that over here where I'm saying, hey, my request body should always look like this. And I've defined that schema to be my consistent way that a request should look like for the pet endpoint. So if we go down here, or the pet object, we can see that we're standardizing that, and then we can keep on going down to further into the schema. But also, before we hop away from this, I can use this particular editor. It's not just an editor, but I can use it to be a place to hold conversation. So going back to collaboration, it's really important because if we have different stakeholders working on this specific specification, we want them to be able to leave feedback. We want a way to respond to that feedback. And that's going to be really important for the communication cycle. And over here on the left, or right rather, we have another really important bit of collaboration. So as I'm building out and designing my API in the middle over here, I will be able to play with it over here on the right. So I can see all my different endpoints, and if I expand one of these endpoints, it's telling me what does a request look like, what are the various responses, and I can use this try it out button to say, okay, what happens when I post to the pet endpoint and I give it this specific request body? Maybe I change that body and I execute that. So it'll pull from this definition over here and give me a way of understanding how this works, especially if I'm a developer, different developers from different teams and things like that. I can get a feel for this API before I start building something that uses it. And the final bit about Swagger Hub I want to talk about that's important is knowing when your API is done and telling people when it's done. So it also has built-in versioning that can make it really easy to say, this is what 1.0.0 of my API looks like. And then as I start development on the next iteration, I can increment that and keep track of all these different changes that I've made very easily. All right, we've got a few minutes left. I do want to leave some time for Q&A. So we'll go to the third phase of collaboration, which is how I actually implemented the code, how I actually did something, and collaborating around that. So what we're looking at is our tool called Collaborator. And Collaborator is our peer review tool for both code and documents. And actually, let me just stay here. And what we're looking at is some code that I've generated from Swagger Hub, basically the framework of my API that I would then later implement. I didn't actually implement anything on this one. It's my little secret demo magic. But the point is I can use Collaborator to go into here. I can see all the files that I've added to my review, and now I can see the differences between the different versions of the files that I've uploaded to Collaborator. I can start to leave feedback on this file. Oops. And I can start to log things like changes. So if I'm asking my author to make some changes to my code file or my document, I can track that very easily. Again, this is important for collaboration, so we're all on the same page about what needs to change before we call this code or document or artifact, whatever it is, ready for release. So it makes the process of working as a team on review a lot easier. In addition to that, I can also use Collaborator to specify how I want to perform review so that my team consistently performs review time in and time out. Up here, I can use these things called templates to say, okay, every time we're doing a review on a new feature, and let me scroll down a bit, we always have to go through this checklist. So for this particular workflow, things like product signing off, UX signing off, some information about how we should do branch naming and commit squashing, right? So I can build out these different templates. This particular server only has these 2 templates built out, but you can build whatever templates you need to drive those different workflows to make sure that all these different people who are working on this review are collaborating in the right way and doing it in a consistent way. So we got about 2.5 minutes left. That was a little quick to go through all those things. So if you do have any questions, let me know, but I see some questions popping up, so I do want to address those. And looks like the first question is about the amount of data in the test steps.
Real quickly before we do that, just in case people have to drop off, if you do have any interest in learning about any of these tools in a little bit more detail, feel free to check the box and we'll make sure we get you that right information. We recognize it was super quick and you might need a little bit more time or a little bit more in-depth demo. So now I'll let you answer your questions.
Yeah, definitely. So the question is about like what happens if I have a huge amount of data. Going back to hip test, if I drive my hip test scenarios with a massive data table, it's going to hurt readability and things like that. And yeah, that is eventually a problem that you'd have to face. So when it comes to implementing the tests, you probably would maybe want to data drive those tests by an external data source. A great example would be, and I'm going to use our own products because that's something that I'm pretty familiar with in terms of like data driving and that sort of stuff. If you were to implement this particular scenario with one of our tools called Test Complete, which basically it's a record and replay. It records your actions, manual actions on the screen so you can replay them later. In that case, I could connect that to like an Excel sheet, which would let me data drive very easily and in a more kind of readable way. In real life for these hip test scenarios, these individual actions can be sub-implemented. That's not the right way to explain that. These could be, I could get more specific. So if the pet is not in the store, may actually lead to another maybe action word or BDD scenario that's also data driven, right? So you could kind of encapsulate these things and that will help break out the data. So maybe at the highest level, there's only 3 or 4 bits of data I want to go through. But then as I go to the next level of the pet is not in the store, there may be different data points there. And then maybe that has another test that is encapsulated around that we have different data for.
Are there any final questions before we shut it down? I know we are right up against the hour and we wanted to say thank you so much to each and every one of you for joining us today. Hopefully you got some good takeaways. Is it possible to have the presentation? Yes, this presentation was recorded. The slides are also going to be made available to you. So just keep an eye on your email. It should be sent out here around the end of the week, a recording of this, as well as the presentation slides themselves. So hopefully with that, you got some great takeaways. All of your questions were answered, and we really enjoyed talking with all of you. So don't hesitate to reach out. If you do think of a question, feel free to send us an email, and we look forward to hearing from you all soon. And with that, thank you, John, for also joining me and being my co-host today. Much appreciated.
Anytime. It was a blast.
And have a great day, everyone.